Montesquieu was born in 1689 in Aquitaine, which is a region of France that has its own interesting history. It was controlled by England for 299 years, and the story on both sides is pretty interesting. Eleanor of Aquitaine was the Duchess of this territory when she married Henry Plantagenet in 1152, and then 2 years later in 1154 he became King of England. He was crowned Henry II, and so this territory that his wife had inherited became part of England. So this portion of continental Europe, of France, was part of England, and it remained that way for 299 years until the 1453 Battle of Castillon, which basically ended the 100 Years' War. And I think we discussed this when we were looking at the Chronicles, but there's a historical irony or something in this battle because in the same year, in 1453, the Ottomans captured Constantinople on the other end of Europe. So while you have the French and the English slaughtering each other for 100 years, or actually 116 years, meanwhile you have this much more foreign army. It's a foreign religion. The Turks, the Seljuks had come out of Central Asia and probably even East Asia before that, that is capturing the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and really truly now ending that state. But anyway, with the Battle of Castillon, English rule over both Aquitaine and Gascony, two of its major territories on the continent, ended. It still controlled Calais for another 100 years, but eventually the French captured that also. By the time Montesquieu was born in Aquitaine, of course, the French had controlled it for 230 years or so this was history, but that's some of the background of that region. Montesquieu's family were Huguenots, who were French Calvinists who followed a particular Swiss leader named Besançon Hugues, and they are probably best known for having been targeted in the 1572 St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which happened amid the French wars of religion, and it's estimated that over 2 days across France, somewhere between 5 and 30,000 Huguenots were killed. Montesquieu's mother died when he was very young, and so he was sent to a Catholic college from 1700 to 1711. Then his father died in 1713, and apparently he became a ward of his uncle. But by then he would have been 24 years old or so I'm not sure exactly what a ward would have meant. But anyway, then his uncle died only a few years later in 1716, but his uncle left him a fortune, a library of more than 3,000 books that he seems to have put to good use, and a title, which was the office of President à Mortier in the Bordeaux Parliament, which was a post that Montesquieu then held for 12 years. And it was apparently one of the most important legal posts of the Ancien Regime, of the pre-revolutionary French government. They were the top magistrates of the parliaments, which were the appeals courts. So they were the highest judicial institutions. And if I understand that correctly, it sounds like this would have been roughly equivalent to a justice on the Supreme Court of an American state. Since he was one of these judges for Bordeaux and not for all of France, it would have been something like that. And he received that office a year after Louis XIV, the Sun King, died in 1715, after reigning for 72 years and 110 days, which is the longest reign, of course, of any European monarch. And he was succeeded by the 5-year-old Louis XV. So that changeover had just happened when Montesquieu started this new post. And 5 years later, in 1721, when he was around 32, he published the Persian Letters, which is something for which he's still relatively well known. And it's a satire in which two Persians are visiting Paris and they comment on Paris at the time. And I read that he withdrew from law and wanted to devote himself full-time to writing and scholarship after 12 years. So that would mean that he did that in about 1728. And around the same time, he apparently went on a grand tour of Europe. This was a tradition from the 17th to the 19th centuries for upper-class young men to travel all around Europe, and especially to Italy, to see sights and meet people. And Montesquieu on his tour apparently traveled to Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Germany. He spent a year in Italy and 2 years in England, and he kept a journal during these travels, and he saw many different peoples and climates, which, as we will probably see, affected his thinking and appear in the spirit of the laws, at least, if not his other writings. He reportedly went blind toward the end of his life, and then died in Paris in 1755. He met Voltaire in the fall of 1725, and I would have been very interested in some correspondence or something between them. But it seems that they commented on each other's writings, but it's not clear that they were either friends or enemies. Montesquieu also inspired Denis Diderot, at whose writings we've looked in another episode of this podcast. Diderot puts Montesquieu in a very prominent spot in a major article of his encyclopedia. And the Marquis de Condorcet, a French politician, political economist, mathematician who lived a generation later, also mentions Montesquieu many times in his work. Montesquieu published the book that we're going to be looking at today, The Spirit of the Laws, anonymously in 1748, and it was translated into English in 1750 and received well both in Great Britain and in the colonies. Maybe the most important influence that this book has had has been on the idea of the separation of powers, which he articulates very clearly and is now incorporated into constitutions around the world. But it's a big book that covers a lot of ground, and it's not only an argument about separation of powers. He talks about a lot of different things. And people also credit this book with placing the word despotism into the political lexicon. He uses this word a lot, and apparently it wasn't used very much before, and of course we use that word a lot now. So some people think that this book did more than any other to put that word in our minds. But to list some of the subjects that he talks about alongside separation of powers, he talks about aristocracy, monarchy, despotic government, education, virtue, honor, judgment, civil and criminal law, punishments, Japan, the Roman Senate, luxury, women, China, corruption, war, just war, Alexander the Great, liberty, the English Constitution, Aristotle, free speech, spies, taxes, Islam and Muslims, monks, slavery, polygamy, divorce, industry, commerce, savage and barbarous nations, the Germans, the Tartars, tyranny, Charlemagne, money, debts, usury, commerce, marriage, Pierre Bayle, religion, trial by combat, and feudal Frankish laws. And Montesquieu seems to have had a particular influence on the founding fathers of the United States in their drafting of the U.S. Constitution. One survey of those guys' writings found that Montesquieu was the most cited of any other authority on government and politics among the founding fathers, except for the Bible. So we don't need to sanctify the founding fathers in order to notice Montesquieu's influence and his importance in the history of political thought. And the spirit of law was also denounced by the Sorbonne, and it was listed on the Catholic Church's Index of Prohibited Books in 1751, so just 3 years after it was published. And we might get into some of why that was the case. But now we can look at some passages from The Spirit of the Laws by Montesquieu. This first passage uses the word suffrage, which of course refers to the right to vote. It also mentions someone named Libanius, who was a 4th century writer in the Eastern Roman Empire. And there is in this passage a quote within a quote, so don't let that throw you. But this passage stood out to me because Montesquieu is emphasizing here the importance of the laws that determine who is allowed to vote, or more importantly, who is allowed to influence the government. And it uses a word that's translated here into English as stranger, but in this context it means a foreigner, somebody from outside, not just somebody who you don't know personally, which is how we use the word stranger usually. But he emphasizes that a stranger who intermeddles in the assemblies of the people is usurping the sovereignty of that government. Montesquieu writes, quote, "There can be no exercise of sovereignty but by their suffrages, which are their own will. Now the sovereign's will is the sovereign himself. The laws, therefore, which establish the right of suffrage are fundamental to this government. And indeed it is as important to regulate in a republic in what manner, by whom, to whom, and concerning what suffrages are to be given, as it is in a monarchy to know who is the prince and after what manner he ought to govern. Libanius says that at, quote, Athens a stranger who intermeddled in the assemblies of the people was punished with death, end quote. This is because such a man usurped the rights of sovereignty, end quote. So there's this debate in Enlightenment political philosophy that arguably continues today, which has to do with what man is in a state of nature. Is he prone to conflict? Is he peaceful? Is he violent and aggressive naturally, or do certain conditions make him that way? And the two most prominent examples of this are Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Hobbes, put very simply, saying that man is naturally violent, and Rousseau saying that man is naturally peaceful. Now, Rousseau has some interesting ideas, but I don't really care for him in general because he had 5 children and put them all in an orphanage. But also we can notice that Montesquieu is here articulating that second position on this debate, and he was born 22 years before Rousseau. He's older than Rousseau. So in my education, I always had it emphasized that Rousseau was the standard bearer of that idea. But it might be the case that Rousseau was just reading Montesquieu because they were both French and they lived in close succession. And I don't remember exactly the passages in Rousseau where he explains his views on this topic. It's possible if I read them again, I would find them a little more convincing. But here in just a few lines of Montesquieu, he gives us some pretty lucid reasoning about this that I personally still don't agree with, but I at least understand why he thinks what he thinks. He's not just asserting it. And we could summarize it by saying that when people are all separate individuals before they're in a society, before they join together, they are very aware of their own weakness, and they're all relatively equal. Whereas when they get together, they can suddenly become very powerful. And that power does 2 things. One, it makes them want to take power from other groups, and this prompts wars. But also it makes them want to take advantage of the power within that society. And so it makes them fight against each other also for positions in the hierarchy of the society. So humans coming together creates conflict both between groups of humans and also within the one group. And those 2 things are probably true, but the problem is that that doesn't say anything about the security of people or the violence of people necessarily before they come together, because individuals are not of the same physical or intellectual strength. First of all, men are stronger than women physically, but also some men are stronger than other men, some men are smarter than other men. And the catalog of history shows us that places where humans have not come together in society, or even have come together in smaller societies, are not famously peaceful places. But here's Montesquieu on that topic. Quote, "As soon as mankind enter into a state of society, they lose the sense of their weakness. Equality ceases, and then commences the state of war. Each particular society begins to feel its strength, whence arises a state of war betwixt different nations. The individuals likewise of each society become sensible of their force. Hence the principal advantage of the society they endeavor to convert to their own emolument, which constitutes a state of war betwixt individuals." End quote. In this next passage, Montesquieu is talking about what happens in a society in the absence of virtue. When there is no virtue, or when virtue recedes or decreases, what fills that vacuum? And if his description sounds familiar, we should remember that he was not making some bold prediction about the future. He was a guy who had studied a lot of history and drawn lessons or tried to derive general laws from that. So if it resembles the time that we're living in now, all that means is that some social mechanism that Montesquieu observed is now playing out as well. It's again not so much a prediction as it is just a description of what happens naturally. And remember, the Enlightenment was in part a reaction to the scientific revolution. That first you had guys like Copernicus and Tycho Brahe and Kepler and Galileo and Newton laying out these very hard laws about physics and astronomy, relatively hard. And the Enlightenment was, to some extent, an effort to catch up with that in other fields. And we might say that that project was mostly unsuccessful, and we still don't know nearly as much about what we call social science as what we call physical science. And it's very hard to articulate concrete laws about relatively nebulous concepts like virtue and ambition. But I find this passage to be descriptive of our time. And the fact that Montesquieu wrote this over 250 years ago suggests that he might have been approaching something, some idea that has some general application. And what he says is that in the absence of virtue, ambition fills the void, or at least it fills the minds of those who are disposed to receive it, is what he says. So not necessarily everybody gives into ambition, but many people do. And we can start just by noticing that in our modern parlance, virtue sounds like sort of an old-fashioned word and people don't use it very often. We do here on this podcast, but I'm particularly interested in that concept. Whereas ambition is now seen as a positive thing. Ambitious students are praised and ambitious workers are those who are trying to get the promotion. This is seen as a good thing, whereas Montesquieu was not using it as a good trait. Or at the very least, it's certainly not to be valued more highly than virtue. And he says when this change happens, when virtue recedes and ambition comes in, things that people used to like become a matter of indifference. Before they valued being free because of laws and now they want to be free to break the law. Any rules of action are only viewed as constraints. Any kind of precaution is only a symptom of fear. And most interestingly, he points out that frugality, being careful with your money, is called avarice, whereas trying desperately to get more money is not called avarice. This is a strange reversal that happens in this context. So listen to this and see if it sounds like society today. Quote, "When virtue is banished, ambition invades the minds of those who are disposed to receive it, and avarice possesses the whole community. The objects of their desires are changed. What they were fond of before is become indifferent. They were free while under the restraint of laws, but they would fain now be free to act against law. And as each citizen is like a slave who has run away from his master, what was a maxim of equity he calls rigor, what was a rule of action he styles constraint, and to precaution he gives the name fear. Frugality, and not the thirst of gain, now passes for avarice." End quote. And one conversation that goes throughout a lot of the book is the differences and similarities between monarchy, republic, and despotism. And a republic is when the people or a portion of the people hold the sovereign power. And of course, when it's all the people, he calls that a democracy. And when it's a subsection of the people, he calls that aristocracy. A monarchy is when one person holds the sovereign power, but they rule according to fixed laws. And despotism is when one person holds the sovereign power, but they rule only according to their will without fixed laws. And he says that the defining principle of a republic is virtue, that of a monarchy is honor, and that of a despotism is fear. And he gets into the role that each of these principles play in the society under their respective governments. And within that context, he gets into something that's very important and is a little bit dystopian, which is how the forms of government shape the individuals living under them, how over time it can change their behavior and their thinking. And in one passage, he describes how despotism affects the individuals living under it. Montesquieu writes, quote, "In despotic states, the nature of government requires the most passive obedience, and when once the prince's will is made known, it ought infallibly to produce its effect. Here they have no limitations or restrictions, no mediums, terms, equivalents, or remonstrances, no change to propose. Man is a creature that blindly submits to the absolute will of the sovereign. In a country like this, they are no more allowed to represent their apprehensions of a future danger than to impute their miscarriage to the capriciousness of fortune. Man's portion here, like that of beasts, is instinct, compliance, and punishment. Little does it then avail to plead the sentiments of nature, filial respect, conjugal or parental tenderness, the laws of honor, or want of health. The order is given, and that is sufficient." End quote. And another idea that runs throughout the book is that laws and government should be designed according to the people who are to be governed. That not all laws will be suitable for all peoples, and that it will be an unlikely occurrence, a kind of luck, when different peoples can be governed by the same laws. And he says they should be written according to geography, to soil, to customs, to the professions of the people concerned, their religion. And it's in this passage that he says very explicitly what he's doing with this book. Montesquieu writes, quote, "Law in general is human reason, inasmuch as it governs all the inhabitants of the earth. The political and civil laws of each nation ought to be only the particular cases in which human reason is applied. They should be adapted in such a manner to the people for whom they are framed, that it is a great chance if those of one nation suit another. They should be relative to the nature and principle of each government, whether they form it, as may be said of political laws, or whether they support it, as in the case of civil institutions. They should be relative to the climate of each country, to the quality of its soil, to its situation and extent, to the principal occupation of the natives, whether husbandmen, huntsmen, or shepherds. They should have a relation to the degree of liberty which the Constitution will bear, to the religion of the inhabitants, to their inclinations, riches, numbers, commerce, manners, and customs. In fine, they have relations to each other, as also to their origin, to the intent of the legislator, and to the order of things on which they are established, in all which different lights they ought to be considered. This is what I have undertaken to perform in the following work. These relations I shall examine, since all these together constitute what I call the spirit of laws." end quote. This next couple of passages stood out to me because it's about music, and he comments first on how various major Greek thinkers, Polybius, Plato, Aristotle, have commented on the relationship between music and virtue, or music and government, and he winds up by saying that music is preferable because, quote, of all sensible pleasures, there is none that less corrupts the soul, end quote. And there he means sensible as in sensed, something that you can enjoy with your senses. He says, of those things, music corrupts the soul the least. And that stood out to me because sometimes when I find myself wanting to wind down in the evening and I'm a little bit too tired to read, but it seems increasingly to me that everything on television is degenerate and I don't want to look at that, I may instead wind down by listening to some music for 10 or 15 minutes before bed because that seems like a relatively pure form of enjoyment. It doesn't make you drunk. It doesn't give you cancer. It doesn't try to persuade you of some untrue idea. And it feels like that's part of what Montesquieu was getting at here. He writes, quote, that judicious writer, Polybius, informs us that music was necessary to soften the manners of the Arcadians, who lived in a cold, gloomy country, that the inhabitants of Cyrene, who slighted music, were the cruelest of all the Greeks, and that no other town was so immersed in luxury and debauch. Plato is not afraid to affirm that there is no possibility of making a change in music without altering the frame of government. Aristotle, who seems to have written his Politics only in order to contradict Plato, agrees with him, notwithstanding, in regard to the power and influence of music over the manners of the people. Skipping ahead, some will ask, why should music be pitched upon preferable to any other entertainment? It is because of all sensible pleasures, there is none that less corrupts the soul. End quote. In this next passage, he's talking about virtue and vice and ancient and modern customs. And for me, this passage is not about encouraging LARPing as though we were living 1,000 years ago or something, but a couple of things. One is that it reminds me of this idea that we've discussed a few times, and so I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but the idea that the older and more widespread a custom or a behavior is, the more likely it is to have some benefit, whether that benefit is immediately apparent or not. And the other is he emphasizes plain and simple manners. He says that the people who built things throughout history had very plain and simple manners. And that's an assertion, and maybe we could challenge it, but it seems intuitively true that the people who get things done are not tangled up in a lot of elaborate display and preening. And he says that if you stick to ancient customs, you'll be more likely thereby to connect to, the phrase he uses is, an original purity of morals. But the last line here is my favorite. He says that the descent to vice is insensible, that we often don't notice when we're descending into vice as a society. And he says, but there's no reascending to virtue without making the most generous efforts. It's easy to go down and you don't notice when it's happening, and it's really hard to pull back up. Montesquieu writes, quote, the preservation of the ancient customs is a very considerable point in respect to manners, since a corrupt people seldom perform any memorable actions, seldom establish societies, build cities, or enact laws. On the contrary, since most institutions are derived from people whose manners are plain and simple, to keep up the ancient custom is the way to preserve the original purity of morals. Skipping ahead, ancient institutions generally tend to reform the people's manners, and those of modern date to corrupt them. In the course of a long administration, the descent to vice is insensible, but there is no reascending to virtue without making the most generous efforts. End quote. In another passage, he talks about how, in the Republican period of Rome, citizens were free to accuse one another, and this was a positive thing because supposedly everybody wanted what was good for the people. But he says this continued into the imperial period, and there it gave rise to informers. And this was not as good. And interestingly, he says during the time that he was living, he says, thank goodness we don't know anything about that. I don't know if he was being sarcastic or serious there, but he gives a short description of informants. Montesquieu writes, quote, at Rome, it was lawful for one citizen to accuse another. This was agreeable to the spirit of a republic, where each citizen ought to have an unlimited zeal for the public good, and is supposed to hold all the rights of his country in his own hands. Under the emperors, the republican maxims were still pursued, and instantly appeared a pernicious tribe, a swarm of informers, crafty, wicked men, who could stoop to any indignity to serve the purposes of their ambition, were sure to busy themselves in the search of criminals whose condemnation might be agreeable to the prince. This was the road to honor and preferment, but luckily we are strangers to it in our country." End quote. So we will often look at the past and we can identify ways in which a certain thinker in a certain period is constrained by the zeitgeist of the time that he's living in, by the dominant ideology of that time and place. And we may often be correct in doing so. But what's harder to do is to see the dominant ideology that we are living under now. And there are passages of Montesquieu that, if you read them closely, can help us to do that a little bit. In this next one, he talks about the political problem of wealth and luxury. And in 21st century America, and probably Europe as well, it's basically an unspoken assumption that as much wealth as you can have is always an improvement. Wealth is good, more wealth is better. Now, you would lose some people if you said the same about luxury. Luxury is a word that some people are a little bit more cautious about. But even there, people might say that the danger of luxury is that it can make you soft and weak, so you don't want to have too much of it. And in this passage, Montesquieu talks about how wealth and luxury actually cause a political problem in that they create desires in people. We talk about how modern life creates artificial desires for products that are for sale, that if they weren't produced, you would never feel the lack of them. But now that they are available, people can become addicted to them. And Montesquieu says that if people have only what they need, then all that they think about is their own reputation and the glory of their country. But if they have more than they need, then they have these synthetic desires that they then have to answer, and they will sometimes break the law in order to answer them. So this is a political problem. It's a disorder that's created by wealth and luxury beyond a certain bound. Montesquieu writes, quote, "In proportion as luxury gains ground in a republic, the minds of the people are turned towards their particular interests. Those who are allowed only what is necessary have nothing but their own reputation and their country's glory in view. But a soul depraved by luxury has many other desires, and soon becomes an enemy to the laws that confine it." Skipping ahead, "No sooner were the Romans corrupted than their desires became boundless and immense. Of this we may judge by the price they set on things." Skipping ahead, and right here he lists a bunch of different items you could buy in Rome and how expensive they became. Then back to the text. "When the whole world, impelled by the force of corruption, is immersed in voluptuousness, what must then become of virtue?" End quote. In this next passage, he talks about the position of women under despotic governments. And Montesquieu has a fair knowledge of Islam and of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire. And when he's talking about despotism, he often gives that example, though he gives others as well. And here he argues that under despotism, women are kept under tight control because women can sometimes cause problems in various ways. And the consequences of those problems would be much more severe, even for their husbands, under a despotism. So men have a motivation to keep women under tighter control in that context. And I'm not sure if I buy that, because here he doesn't really talk about the role of Islam. He says that it's just a result of the government. And I think Islam has a role to play there as well, or at least male jealousy. But this is an interesting angle that I hadn't thought about. This is again an example of how the government affects the behavior of the people living under it. And this may be a component in a cultural practice that we attribute to a religion. Montesquieu writes, quote, "In despotic governments, women do not introduce, but are themselves an object of luxury. They must be in a state of the most rigorous servitude. Everyone follows the spirit of the government and adopts in his own family the customs he sees elsewhere established. As the laws are very severe and executed on the spot, they are afraid lest the liberty of women should expose them to danger. Their quarrels, indiscretions, repugnances, jealousies, piques, and that art, in fine, which little souls have of interesting great ones, would be attended there with fatal consequences." End quote. In a later passage, he talks about the center and the periphery of empire, and specifically of a despotism. And he gives a reference to geometry, talking about how as a body increases in its area, the circumference decreases in proportion. That is, if you have a smaller shape, a circle, for example, the difference between the circumference and the area is greater on a smaller circle, proportionally, than it would be on a larger circle. And that's because there's a square involved, that the area of a circle is pi r squared. So as the radius increases geometrically, if you have a radius of a circle that's 3 inches, and then you increase it to 4 inches, the square of 3 is 9 and of 4 is 16. So that gap is widening. The area is growing more quickly than the circumference is. But he says that republics find their security, the government finds their security in uniting the people under them. He doesn't say the people under them, he says uniting, but it seems like that's the implication. And he says despotic governments maintain their security by dividing, by separating. And they also ravage the frontiers of the land that they control in order to keep the center strong. They burn the edges of their empire in one way or another in order to secure that core. And he says this works better for larger states than for smaller ones for that reason that he gives from geometry, that if you have a bigger state, then the circumference is smaller, and so it's easier to spend it in this way. And I don't know if I would go as far as to say that the United States is a despotic government exactly, but it seems increasingly hard to call it a republic, and it's certainly not a monarchy. But if we were going to use this example to describe something about the United States, it might be tempting to go geographically to the frontiers of American empire, to go very far away, to Guam maybe, or Iraq. And Iraq might be an example of that, but that almost might be, especially now, outside of the empire. But one clear example, I think, is the way that the Rust Belt, Appalachia, has been basically gutted by globalization, that all of this industry that existed in America in the middle of the 20th century is now basically in China. And in that process, Appalachia and the Rust Belt were very badly damaged. Their economies were removed to a great extent. But the center, the U.S. Capitol, for example, or American finance, gained tremendously from that move. So while the Rust Belt might be geographically near the heart of America, it's near the center, in this political sense, or at least in the context of this process, it could be thought of as a frontier that has been expended in this way. Montesquieu writes, quote, "As republics provide for their security by uniting, despotic governments do it by separating and by keeping themselves, as it were, single. They sacrifice a part of the country, and by ravaging and desolating the frontiers, they render the heart of the empire inaccessible. It is a received axiom in geometry that the greater the extent of bodies, the more their circumference is relatively small. This practice, therefore, of laying the frontiers waste is more tolerable in large than in middling states." End quote. Later in another passage, Montesquieu is again talking about the way government affects human behavior. And he gives this interesting example that I'd never noticed. He talks about castles, about physical castles. And he doesn't say this part explicitly, but if you look at the map of Europe, there are thousands of castles, maybe tens of thousands of castles across Europe. I don't know how many. And if you look at modern Turkey, or the footprint of the Ottoman Empire, but we can focus on Turkey, there are certainly Ottoman architecture, there's Seljuk architecture, pre-Ottoman Turkish architecture, there's ancient Greek ruins, there are lots of old buildings there, but there aren't really castles, and I'd never noticed that. And Montesquieu, without giving that example specifically, but I think that's what he's pointing at, offers a hypothesis for why that is. He says that castles require trust in a sub-commander, and a despot doesn't have that trust in any of his people. He can't send somebody to go man a castle, because the moment he does, the person in command of the castle and everybody under him might declare their independence, because they have no affection for, that's the term that Montesquieu uses, the prince or his government. So that's an example of how the level of trust in a government has actually shaped the physical contours of it, the way that that government appears on the landscape. And of course, many castles in Europe belonged to one feudal ruler. They weren't part of some superstructure. But the ones that were involved this trust given from the sovereign to the guy who was in charge of that castle. So again, Montesquieu argues that those human relations are reflected in the physical apparatus of the states that those people formed. And indeed, when you think about it, what else would be reflected in them? But such a stark example is very interesting. This is why Montesquieu would say there are no Ottoman castles, or relatively few. Quote, "Fortresses are proper for monarchies. Despotic governments are afraid of them. They dare not entrust their officers with such a command, as none of them have any affection for the prince or his government." End quote. Later he talks about how sending a foreign army to some faraway place in order to unite the people at home maybe causes more problems than it solves. Montesquieu writes, quote, "It was a saying of the Lord of Coucy to King Charles V, quote, that the English are never weaker nor easier to overcome than in their own country." End quote. The same was observed by the Romans, the same of the Carthaginians, and the same will happen to every power that sends armies to distant countries in order to reunite,
by discipline and military force those who are divided among themselves by political or civil interests. The state finds itself weakened by the disorder that still continues, and more so by the remedy." End quote. In this next passage, he gives a couple examples of how two different governors from history have used laws to try to weaken deliberately the people under them, the people whom the laws were governing. And in the first example, he talks about Cyrus, and I guess that's Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great, major Persian leader from the 6th century BC, governing the Lydians, who were Greeks living in western Anatolia, the western part of what is now Turkey. And Montesquieu says that Cyrus limited the professions that the Lydians could hold, and he did this in order to prevent a revolt, so that the Lydians would not be strong enough to revolt against him, but it did not help in guarding against an invasion, and that Cyrus trying to corrupt the Lydians in this way would eventually corrupt the Persians also, that there would be a spread within this empire from the corruption in the one area to the other parts. And he also talks about a tyrant of Cuma. Cuma was one of the Greek colonies on what is now southern Italy. It apparently existed in the 8th century BC, so it's very old. And there was a tyrant there named Aristodemus. And it seems that deliberately, according to Montesquieu, tried to make the young men there very effeminate to keep them from threatening his power. In order to secure himself, he tried to make them weak in this way. He, quote, used all his endeavors to banish courage and to enervate the minds of youth, end quote. He required boys to grow their hair out long, to put flowers in their hair, to wear long colored robes down to their heels, to have women carry their umbrellas and perfumes and fans for them, and to give them combs and mirrors whenever they took a bath. Generally, he tried to make them effeminate. This tyrant tried to make the young men be like women, and this was a means of security for the tyrant. Montesquieu writes, quote, far am I from thinking that a good law, which Cyrus made to oblige the Lydians to practice none but mean or infamous professions. It is true, he directed his attention to an object of the greatest importance. He thought of guarding against revolts and not invasions, but invasions will soon come when the Persians and Lydians unite and corrupt each other. I would therefore much rather support by laws the simplicity and rudeness of the conquering nation than the effeminacy of the conquered. Aristodemus, tyrant of Cuma, used all his endeavors to banish courage and to enervate the minds of youth. He ordered that boys should let their hair grow in the same manner as girls, that they should deck it with flowers and wear long robes of different colors down to their heels, that when they went to their masters of music and dancing, they should have women with them to carry their umbrellas, perfumes, and fans, and to present them with combs and looking glasses whenever they bathed. This education lasted till the age of 20, an education that could be agreeable to none but to a petty tyrant who exposes his sovereignty to defend his life. End quote. At one point, he gets into a pretty elaborate defense of free speech that seems to have contributed pretty directly to the eventual establishment of the First Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. A lot of what he talks about there seems very familiar. Of taxes, he writes, quote, the public revenues are a portion that each subject gives of his property in order to secure or enjoy the remainder. To fix these revenues in a proper manner, regard should be had both to the necessities of the state and to those of the subject. The real wants of the people ought never to give way to the imaginary wants of the state. Imaginary wants are those which flow from the passions and the weakness of the governors, from the vain conceit of some extraordinary project, from the inordinate desire of glory, and from a certain impotence of mind incapable of withstanding the impulse of fancy. Often have ministers of a restless disposition imagined that the wants of their own mean and ignoble souls were those of the state. Skipping ahead, the public revenues should not be measured by the people's abilities to give, but by what they ought to give. End quote. And I like that passage because it articulates very briefly a position on taxes that's neither higher taxes are good or higher taxes are bad. This is a kind of knee-jerk reaction that a lot of people get into, that they will defend a new tax just by its nature of being a tax, or they will attack it for the same reason. And to me, both of those seem stupid. The question is, what is the tax being used for? Is that a worthwhile purpose? And is this tax going to be able to achieve that goal? I like that guideline. The real wants of the people ought never to give way to the imaginary wants of the state. And one more, the public revenues should not be measured by the people's ability to give, but by what they ought to give. Now, of course, what they ought to give still requires a lot of debate and discussion, but that's a better parameter than people can afford this tax. Doesn't matter if people can afford it or not. The question is it valid? On usury, he writes at one point, quote, in the ancient language of the Romans, interest at 6% was called half usury, and interest at 3% quarter usury. Total usury must therefore have been interest at 12%, end quote. Now, in preparing to talk about this, I checked what the average credit card interest rate was, and as of early September 2025, when I'm recording this, the average credit card interest rate in the United States was 25%. So for the ancient Romans, full usury was interest at 12%. So that means we might say that in America in the 21st century, we are at double usury on average by that same standard. Plenty of people have a credit card with an interest rate of 36%. Such cards exist. So that would be triple usury. But I'm just talking about the average. The average in the United States has cleared double usury according to the ancient Romans. In this next passage, he starts by talking about how in ancient Rome, first age had a privilege, but then when they wanted more citizens, that privilege was instead transferred from age to marriage and to the number of children. And then he goes through a list of the different privileges that were given to first people who were married and then to people who had children and how many children they had and the honors that they received. And then after that, he gets into some of the penalties for people who either weren't married or they were married but they didn't have children. And later he talks about the danger of celibacy, but it's important to note that here he's using celibacy not to mean refraining from sex, but the original meaning, which was refraining from marriage. So he criticizes celibacy, that is refraining from getting married when it's not based on religion. And then he concludes with a thought about his own times. This one is a little bit longer than some of the other passages we've looked at so far, but it's definitely worth it. And just a note, he refers to she a few times here, but there he's talking about the Republic. He's referring to the Republic as she. Montesquieu writes, quote, the Romans, who for the most part sprung from the cities of the Latins, which were Lacedaemonian colonies, and had received a part of their laws even from those cities, had, like the Lacedaemonians, such veneration for old age as to give it all honor and precedency. When the Republic wanted citizens, she granted to marriage and to a number of children the privileges which had been given to age. She granted some to marriage alone, independently of the children which might spring from it. This was called the right of husbands. She gave others to those who had any children, and larger still to those who had 3 children. These 3 things must not be confounded. These last had those privileges which married men constantly enjoyed, as, for example, a particular place in the theater. They had those which could only be enjoyed by men who had children, and which none could deprive them of but such as had a greater number. These privileges were very extensive. The married men who had the most children were always preferred, whether in the pursuit or in the exercise of honors. The consul who had the most numerous offspring was the first who received the fasces. He had his choice of the provinces. The senator who had the most children had his name written first in the catalogue of senators, and was the first in giving his opinion in the Senate. They might even stand sooner than ordinary for an office, because every child gave a dispensation of a year. If an inhabitant of Rome had 3 children, he was exempted from all troublesome offices. The freeborn women who had 3 children, and the freed women who had 4, passed out of that perpetual tutelage in which they had been held by the ancient laws of Rome. As they had rewards, they had also penalties. Those who were not married could receive no advantage from the will of any person that was not a relation, and those who being married had no children could receive only half. The Romans, says Plutarch, marry only to be heirs and not to have them. Skipping ahead. The same spiritual reason which had permitted celibacy soon imposed it even as necessary. God forbid that I should here speak against celibacy as adopted by religion. But who can be silent when it is built on libertinism, when the 2 sexes, corrupting each other even by the natural sensations themselves, fly from a union which ought to make them better, to live in that which always renders them worse? It is a rule drawn from nature, that the more the number of marriages is diminished, the more corrupt are those who have entered into that state. The fewer married men, the less fidelity is there in marriage, as when there are more thieves, more thefts are committed. skipping ahead, and later he gives his own view. He says, "From all this we may conclude that Europe is at present in a condition to require laws to be made in favor of the propagation of the human species. The politics of the ancient Greeks incessantly complain of the inconveniences attending a republic from the excessive number of citizens, but the politics of this age call upon us to take proper means to increase ours." End quote. Later he gets into a long section about the history of the Frankish laws, the laws of the Franks in the Middle Ages, basically. And within that, he talks a fair amount about trial by combat, this practice that we looked at a little when we were reading Njal's saga. In that case, it was in Iceland, but he talks about it in what is now France, this practice of settling judicial disputes in single combat, either to first blood or to incapacitation or to the death. And this practice is, of course, now illegal, and it's probably good that it is. But he gives an interesting explanation. I won't say a defense. It doesn't seem like he wishes that people were still dueling in this way. But he explains an angle from which to view this practice, and from which the people who performed it probably viewed it. That's interesting and that I hadn't thought about before. Montesquieu writes, quote, "The trial by combat had some reason for it founded on experience. In a military nation, cowardice supposes other vices. It is an argument of a person's having deviated from the principles of his education, of his being insensible of honor, and of having refused to be directed by those maxims which govern other men. It shows that he neither fears their contempt nor sets any value upon their esteem. Men of any tolerable extradition seldom want either the dexterity requisite to cooperate with strength, or the strength necessary to concur with courage. For as they set a value upon honor, they are practiced in matters without which this honor cannot be obtained. Besides, in a military nation, where strength, courage, and prowess are esteemed, crimes really odious are those which arise from fraud, artifice, and cunning, that is, from cowardice." End quote. And this text is generally pretty formal, but there are a few spots where we see Montesquieu's personality come through a little bit, and so we can close with one of those that I liked. And here he talks about this book, but he doesn't mean the whole book, he means the chapter that he's talking about. But then he gives a general comment that's nice. Montesquieu writes, quote, "The end of this book, I should be glad to inquire into the distribution of the three powers in all the moderate governments we are acquainted with, in order to calculate the degrees of liberty which each may enjoy. But we must not always exhaust a subject, so as to leave no work at all for the reader. My business is not to make people read, but to make them think." End quote. And that's literally less than a quarter of the passages that I had originally marked off to show you, but that gives you a sampling of some of the material that's in there. This is still a book that is assigned, I think, in undergraduate courses and graduate courses on political science, international relations, history. But I had never read it, and it's very valuable for the topic that he's discussing. If you're interested in this subject in general, this is definitely one you should have for your bookshelf, and you should spend some time with. If you enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll send it to a thoughtful friend who you think will enjoy it as well. But otherwise, we can leave it there for now. Farewell until next time. Take care, and happy reading.